It didn't start with missiles, it started with messages, lines of code, silent digital pulses sent across invisible networks. Ukraine wasn't just fighting on land, it was fighting online, in data centers, through algorithms and hacked transmissions. When Russia rolled tanks across the border, Ukraine was already rolling out something else: cyber resistance. Not with massive armies or nuclear threats, but with laptops and smartphones, a network of coders, engineers, and digital warriors who knew how to think fast, adapt faster, and make every click count. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. Many were students, gamers, software developers, but when the invasion came, they mobilized like a battalion. Anonymous cyber collectives took aim at Russian propaganda. Ukrainian developers shut down GPS in enemy vehicles. Hackers jammed Russian military communications, redirected drone feeds, and exposed the positions of advancing troops, all in real time. This wasn't science fiction. This was the new face of war, and Ukraine was writing the rules as it went. Imagine being in a war zone, surrounded by uncertainty, and your phone buzzes, not with fear, but with instructions, updates, coordinates from a digital command center powered by volunteers. That's what happened. Grandmothers in villages were forwarding photos of tank movements to intelligence apps. Teens in Kyiv were tracking Russian soldiers through TikTok videos. The line between civilian and soldier blurred, and it gave Ukraine something Russia couldn't anticipate: agility. Russia came in expecting brute force to win, but brute force can't match the speed of decentralized thinking. It can't keep up with a population that thinks in code, that can build, break, and rebuild faster than any top-down military directive. While Russia relied on outdated Soviet-era command chains, Ukraine was building a war machine out of cloud storage, open-source platforms, and digital resilience. And behind every hacked server, every jammed radar system, there was a person. A son, a daughter, a neighbor who decided that their mind was a weapon, and that the battlefield didn't need to be a trench to be deadly. In a world where information is power, Ukraine proved that the sharpest blade isn't forged in steel, it's written in code. And in doing so, they cracked more than systems. They cracked the myth of Russian dominance, one keystroke at a time. In a war where every second counts, Ukraine learned to see in real time. Not days later, not through delayed reports, but instantly. That was the difference. That was the code they cracked. While Russian forces operated like a slow-moving giant, burdened by rigid chains of command and outdated intelligence, Ukraine moved like a swarm, fast, fluid, and fully aware of the battlefield as it shifted moment by moment. It started with a connection between NATO's satellites, Ukrainian drone pilots, ground troops, and command centers. A connection that turned into a nervous system. From the skies above to the streets below, Ukraine wasn't just reacting to Russia, it was predicting, anticipating, recalibrating with every new image, every intercepted message, every shared piece of intel. A tank convoy spotted in the south, coordinates were relayed in seconds. Drones adjusted, artillery zeroed in, and by the time the Russians realized what was happening, the landscape had changed beneath them. But this wasn't just high-tech war, it was deeply human. It was a father using his drone hobby to protect his neighborhood. It was engineers building software that could recognize troop formations before the eye could. It was frontline soldiers trusting data coming from satellites they'd never seen, because they knew this information might save their lives. Unlike Russia's top-down approach, Ukraine empowered units on the ground. Data wasn't locked away in bunkers, it flowed. That trust, that agility, made the impossible feel possible. Soldiers didn't have to wait for orders from a distant command. They could act on what they saw, supported by intelligence that was clear, fast, and deadly accurate. It turned every Ukrainian soldier into a strategist, every phone into a sensor, and every battlefield into a map of opportunity. Russia had size, but Ukraine had sight, and in war, vision matters more than volume. When you can see your enemy before they see you, when you can strike precisely while they stumble blindly, you don't just level the playing field, you tilt it. This was more than a military advantage, it was a mindset shift. Ukraine showed the world that with the right intelligence, delivered in the right way, even a smaller nation can outmaneuver a superpower. Not by fighting harder, but by seeing smarter. And in the quiet hum of servers and the steady feed of satellite imagery, Ukraine built its edge, not in brute strength, but in clarity. There's something powerful about a fight where one side isn't supposed to stand a chance, where the odds are stacked so high that the world watches with folded arms, expecting a swift defeat. That was Ukraine on day one. A smaller military, fewer weapons, outgunned and outnumbered by a nation that had long prided itself on raw military might. But what the world underestimated, and what Russia couldn't calculate, was that when you corner a nation fighting for its survival, you awaken something far stronger than numbers. You awaken purpose. Ukraine didn't have the luxury of matching Russia tank for tank, jet for jet. So they rewrote the rules of the fight. They became unpredictable, mobile, disruptive. This wasn't just resistance, it was innovation born out of desperation. While Russian columns stretched out across highways, vulnerable and overconfident, Ukrainian units used hit-and-run tactics, striking fast and disappearing before the dust settled. They knew the terrain, they knew the rhythm of their own cities, and more importantly, they knew the value of every move, every bullet, every decision. Picture this, a unit of Ukrainian fighters, maybe a dozen at most, hiding in the tree line, watching a line of armored vehicles approach. They don't charge, they calculate. They wait for just the right moment to hit the convoy's center, splitting it in half, creating panic and confusion. It's not about overwhelming force, it's about strategic disruption. It's about knowing that victory doesn't always come from overpowering your enemy, but from outthinking them. They used everything. Abandoned buildings became command posts. Civilian vehicles were retrofitted to carry anti-tank weapons. Even the wreckage of previous battles was repurposed. What Russia saw as rubble, Ukraine saw as cover. What looked like weakness was actually adaptation. And while Russia relied on brute force and Soviet-era tactics, Ukraine evolved in real time, adjusting, innovating, and fighting with a flexibility that large armies just aren't built for. And then there's the human side of it all, the emotion that numbers and reports can't measure. Young soldiers who left college classrooms to pick up rifles, mothers who stayed behind not because they had to, but because they chose to defend the street they raised their children on. Volunteers who biked supplies through shelling zones, knowing full well they might not return. There's no algorithm for that kind of courage. No military doctrine that teaches you how to weaponize sheer will. Russia had plans, Ukraine had heart. And when you mix heart with intelligence, courage with innovation, you get something truly dangerous. A force that doesn't back down, even when logic says it should. That's what turned Ukraine from an underdog into a nightmare for Russian generals. They weren't just resisting, they were redefining what resistance looked like. Every ambush, every counterattack, every inch of reclaimed land was a message. You may have come with power, but we came with purpose. And in the end, that's what makes the difference. You can drop the most advanced weapon into a war zone, but if you don't know how to use it in the terrain you're fighting on, it's just dead weight. Ukraine understood that early. They didn't just receive Western weapons and plug them into old tactics, they adapted everything to their reality. Open fields, dense cities, broken roads, every piece of ground became part of the strategy, and they turned that knowledge into power. When HIMARS systems arrived, Ukraine didn't waste time showing them off. They got to work learning how to make every rocket count. Not just on enemy bases, but on supply depots, bridges, command posts, targets that would slow Russia down without wasting precious ammunition. They studied patterns, they struck at night. They coordinated with drones flying overhead and soldiers on the ground. It was all about precision.